Hello, and welcome to week number 7 of Intro to Theater Online. As always, I'm your professor, Andrew Friedman. I hope that you're all doing well and still enjoying the class. I know that we have been through a very busy stretch of this course so far. The workload is quite heavy, but part of that is because we are almost at the end. We have 2 short weeks until our 8-week semester is over. And what that also means is it is time to start preparing for your final exam. The final exam will cover materials weeks number 5 through 8, and that exam will take place in the final week of this 8-week course, meaning that your final exam will be available starting October the 12th at 8 a.m. It will conclude on October the 17th at midnight, meaning that 1 minute after midnight, as soon as it's October the 18th, the exam will no longer be available. So please register now through B Virtual Online Proctoring, the same service we use for the midterm. Schedule yourself an appointment to take this exam. Again, it will be available starting October the 12th at 8 a.m. The exam period will close on October the 17th at midnight. Okay, so for this week, we're covering 2 topics in 2 separate chapters. We're reading about musical theater, and we're also reading about mediated performance. Now, the musical theater chapter is something that you may have some familiarity with. In fact, musical theater is one of the most popular forms of theater going at the current moment. I'm sure most of you, whether you've spent much time in the theater or not, have heard of musicals like The Book of Mormon, or Hamilton, or Cats, or Les Mis, right? It is an art form that is popular throughout the United States and, in fact, throughout the world. So in this chapter on musical theater, you'll be learning about the various elements of musical theater and what makes musical theater different from the genres like comedy and tragedy that we've seen so far. So 4 of the main components that you'll be looking at are music, lyrics, libretto, and dance, right? So keep your eyes open for that. And one of the things that you'll be considering as part of that is your Broadway assignment. The instructions for that assignment are at the bottom of this week's learning module. Please read them carefully and follow the web address to find productions that you can write about. Now, in addition to looking at some of the more obvious elements of these various musicals that you'll write about, I would also encourage you to keep in mind things that oftentimes fall to the background. If one of the things this assignment is about is understanding the difference between Broadway and off-Broadway, right, and the musical theater being one of the main components of Broadway, is what else besides the show constitutes that difference? So I would encourage you to look at the run schedule of the performances. How many performances do these shows have in a week? How long have they been running for? How much do tickets cost? Who's affiliated with these various productions? Many of these seemingly finer grained details tell us a lot about the difference between these 2 worlds, right? And one of the things to consider here and keep in mind is that Broadway, unlike off-Broadway, Broadway is a for-profit venture, right? Meaning that the goal of those shows that are placed on Broadway is to make money, right? They are making art with the idea of making money. Off-Broadway theaters, by and large, are heavily subsidized by federal and state grants that help those institutions run. They may also have subscriber bases, people that return to the same theaters over and over and over again. And those grants and funds and subscribers are there because the types of art that they're seeing, by and large, do not make money, right? they are not necessarily for profit. Every once in a while, some of those shows will make some money, but the theaters that they're housed at in general typically do not, right? So that's one critical difference between the Broadway and off-Broadway model that you should be looking for when you're evaluating those artworks. How can you see that showing up in the ways that the artwork is described, the artwork is advertised, the ticket prices, so on and so forth? So that is your assignment this week, is the Broadway musical review. In addition to that, you have a discussion question and a quiz. Now, in terms of the question of mediated performance, this is something that, at least on the surface, you may have a little less familiarity with. But, in fact, you have a ton of familiarity with this. You may just not know it. Now, the term mediate oftentimes just means to intervene between two things. So if you think about perhaps two people who are suing each other in court, oftentimes they'll go to a mediator who will intervene and help them come to a resolution. Now, while this is different when we're talking about performance, the principle is somewhat the same. So when we're talking about mediated performance, we're talking about something that comes in between you, the spectator, and the performance, right? We have an example of this right now in this video, right? You are the audience, the spectator. I am presumably the performer. And it is this digital platform and this camera on my laptop that's mediating that experience. It's coming in between our communication that we're having right now. And one of the things to consider when we think about mediated performance and theater is what gets cut out of the frame, right? So as you may have noticed for today's video, I decided to frame it up nicely with all of these books behind me on my shelf, right? I am framing your experience. Now, I would hope that this probably suggests something to you, right? Aha, he must be a professor. Look at all of these books. Aha, he must be a professor. He's wearing a button-up shirt and a sweater. Now, we know that if I were to change the angle on the computer, move it around, this might suggest something different to you, right? And one of the things that this shows us is the way in which our experience of live performance can be mediated most often by technology, right? So I would encourage you to think about other ways in which your experience of performance is oftentimes mediated, right? And if we want to return to this idea of musical theater, this oftentimes gets mediated when we see musicals performed on television. And while they may be live, the camera that's filming that performance is changing the way that we see it. So as you may have noticed from having gone to your live performances for your critique, when you're in the theater, you get to look wherever you want. If you're bored, you can look at your shoes or the ceiling, or hopefully not, but sometimes your phone, right? But when you are watching a performance that is mediated through a form of technology, oftentimes the camera serves as your eye. This is also true when we watch film, right? The film camera shows us where to look and when to look there. It determines what we're looking at. While when we go to the theater and we look at a stage, we're seeing a number of different images on the stage at one time. We can look up into this corner or that corner and that part. One of the things that the film does is it focuses our attention. This is also true of sports events. And this perhaps has one of the greatest examples of mediation in our contemporary moment, in things like instant replay, right? So whether you're a fan of tennis or football or baseball or soccer or whatever you may be interested in, Oftentimes, after a play is made or a goal is scored or so on and so forth, we will get an immediate replay of that event, typically in slow motion and close up, right? And oftentimes, if you're watching on TV with commentators, they may be drawing on top of the board, right? So this is an example of having seen a live experience that then we're given again in a mediated form, right? This technology and commentators intervene on the event. Now, it is perhaps understandable that we might think a mediated event is something negative, right? We're not getting the real connection. But in fact, sports is a good example because oftentimes that mediation allows us to see things we wouldn't normally see, right? If it's baseball, it's perhaps because the pitch is too fast. There's no way that we'd be able to see it, right? If it's in football, we can't really tell because it happens too fast to tell whether someone is inbounds or out of bounds when they catch a ball. So mediation is not necessarily a bad thing. The important thing to remember about it, however, is that it changes how we experience the event, right? It has a determining factor on it. Okay, so for this week's work, please keep in mind to complete the Broadway review assignment, your discussion question and quiz, and also to make sure that you register for the final exam, which will be October the 12th through the 17th. Read your chapters on musical theater and mediated performance. I will see you again next week for our final week of Intro to Theater Online. So long.